Okay, so we should have, number one, our reference photo that I sent you the other day. We should have a white piece of paper on our board with at least 5 sheets of newsprint behind it. We should have at least 2 pencils before us. I'm using an HB, or the 4B, 6B, but I'm using the H and the 6B personally. I've got them nice and sharp, so I'm ready to draw. And I've got my kneaded gray eraser, which is this little bendable thing. If for some reason you weren't here when I handed out the supplies to group A and C, then hopefully we'll catch up with you soon. If for some reason you're not coming to class at all anymore because of quarantine, I know at least one person in one of my classes had a roommate who was exposed and she has self-quarantined, then we're going to need to figure out some way to get you your supplies. So email me if that's you, or talk to me after class. Today we're going to watch a lecture, or I guess talk about a lecture. So you'll need your notebooks. And I'm going to do a demonstration, and we're going to start a 2-day drawing. We'll start it today, work on it till the end of class, and then finish it up on Friday. What else? I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so the first thing that we'll do is I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. And everybody here and at home, take out your notebooks. And we'll start the lecture. So get comfy. All right, so this particular kind of transitionary unit is dealing with compound shapes, but it's kind of going to be an accumulation of all the shapes that we've done thus far. So what are the 3 fundamental shapes, Elijah?
Planes, cylinders, and spheres.
Mm-hmm. You got it. So in this particular case, the still life is comprised of planes, cylinders, and spheres. Some of those cylinders being compound shapes, combinations of planes and sphere or cylindrical shapes and spherical shapes. There are a couple spheres in this particular still life, but those are simple enough. With an ellipse, it's unequal height relative to width, the height being smaller than the width. With a circle, it's equal height and width. So when you're drawing a circle, if you have, a cross that's equal height and width, then that will give you a good kind of diagrammatic underpinning to get symmetry in that circle. Another aspect of it is in the gestural phase, which is that very loose, quick, fast, fluid kind of guesswork phase. If you use your arm, you're going to get much better straight lines and curves than if you try to use your wrist. We're still going to be using, on top of gesture drawing, some diagrammatic thinking, looking at angle finding to make corrections to our gestural guesses, looking at the discernment or reading of not only angles, for instance, in planes, or angles on the side of a cone or a bottle that has differences in width, but also the angles of relationship between, say, an object that's higher and an object that's lower. Now, one of the things that I did was I sent everybody an image this morning of the still life from my point of view. So if there's some way for you to pull up both simultaneously, that'll help, because I'm going to be doing a live demo today, just trying something new. But unlike the videos that I normally post, where you either have a side-by-side with the picture and the drawing that I'm working on, or a picture-in-picture with the picture that I'm working from and the picture that I'm working on, today you're going to have to, if you want to watch me calculate out the still life and gesture it out, you're going to have that drawing that I sent you pulled up somehow. If you're on your computer, you might pull it up on your phone or iPad or something like that. Or maybe there's some way to pull it up simultaneously on your computer as you're watching Teams. Okay. Probably after the meeting is over, I will edit this Teams video and put it picture next to picture, so you can go back and watch it, the reference picture and the drawing that I'm working on. But suffice it to say, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to just watch me draw if you don't know what I'm drawing from. Although the second part of this drawing, so the initial gestural constructive line part, will be followed by the second part, which is contour drawing. And that's a kind of new technique that we're going to be learning in the next two drawings. So once I'm done with my initial gesture / diagram, and I'm satisfied with the proportions and placements and scales and compositional arrangement, etc., it doesn't really matter when it comes to the still life whether we can see it or not, because contour line is more about creative thinking than it is about calculated thinking. So we're going to start moving away from a very left-brain mathematical, logical, reasonable approach to a more right-brain creative, imaginative, aesthetic approach. So, as the semester continues, we're going to have more and more quote-unquote freedom in that regard, although we're always going to be bound to the still life for what we're drawing. All right, so as I said, the second part of this is contour line. And contour line is all about linear variation. Line, as we've seen, along with point and plane, is one of the most basic of the fundamental formal elements. And as an element, as with any element, it's one of the ways artists can create unity. And unity is a design principle of arrangement that can basically be described kind of in layman's terms as everything feeling right. Everything feels placed correctly. Everything is given a kind of organization, and the artist has intended a reading that the viewer is supposed to follow, a hierarchy of what's most important and moderately important and least important, and everything just feels right and settled. It's got a harmony of the whole. And of course, this idea varies from artist to artist and from style to style. But the idea of style or form, form being kind of the same idea as style, a unified kind of aesthetic style or form, is all about not just recreating what one sees, but representing what one sees in an expressive manner. Now, when we say expression, we think emotional and dramatic and all of that stuff. Expression doesn't have to be that way. I can express a very scientific, rational, reasonable kind of way of communicating. I can express a very dramatic, emotional kind of feeling when I'm drawn. Oh, right? So it's all about the way one, quote unquote, talks when they're drawing. So, it's the difference between poetry and prose. You know, um, if I was to write a poem about the moon, I might talk about the flat yellow eye rising, set against the dark void of death, pitted by history's movements and moved by the watery eyes of creation. I just made that up just now. That's my poem about the moon. Or I could say, the lunar eclipse cycles, which are intimately bound with the tides of the Earth, express the gravitational force. You follow what I mean? They're both describing the moon and its behavior, but one is very dramatic and one is very scientific. And up to this point, we've been very stylistically logical, or I would equate it with prose. But depending on what kind of style or form you're using, you're creating a kind of content. Now, contour line in itself is a kind of distillation or reduction to essentials. So when you choose to not do value or shading or texture or create atmospheric types of spaces and things like that, and you restrict yourself to line, you're simplifying. You're like, what is the essential that I need to communicate the subject that I'm communicating? It's an essential way of communicating what you're seeing in a two-dimensional format. This simplification or reduction to essentials, or I would even extend the definition to foregrounding or emphasis on one element to the exclusion of others, is what we call abstraction. Now, most people, when they think of abstraction, they think, oh, abstraction is like a pattern or, a painting of just squares or colors or squiggles or whatever. And that is a form of abstraction. But really, abstraction is kind of a middle ground between realism and what we call non-objective painting. Realism is, of course, dependent on the world. Non-objective painting is about shapes that may or may not exist in the world, but they're more about shape for shape's sake and less about communicating nature. And when I say nature, I don't just mean plants and animals. I mean plants, animals, buildings, cars, anything that's in the world is what an artist would call natural. Abstraction is kind of like part of a spectrum. So on one end you have photographic realism, on the other end you have non-objective art for art's sake. In the middle is abstraction. So for instance, on one end you might have Rembrandt, who's very realist as a painter, very naturalistic in the way that he depicts objects and people. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have somebody like Jackson Pollock, who just drips of paint all over the canvas. And then in the middle, you might have Van Gogh, who represents nature, but he does it by exaggeration of color, exaggeration of paint thickness, exaggeration of contour line, hint, hint. So that use of contour line as a form of abstraction is something that you'll see a lot in all kinds of art. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that there's a difference between contour line and outline. Okay? Outline is a flat, uniform line that encloses a space. It has no variation. And as such, is very boring. You see it a lot in cartoons. They outline a figure and then the filling of shape with a color that's flat. like The Simpsons or Family Guy or American Dad or whatever, hip Bob's Burgers, etc. When you take a line for a walk, to quote the artist Paul Klee, Klee, whose work we'll look at in a second, you're being creative with that line. You're creating variation. You're creating personality. You're creating differences or dynamics in the line quality. So quality, line quality, refers to style. An artist, each one of us is a different height, a different personality, a different background. We all have different handwriting. Well, we all have different line qualities as well. So every one of us, our drawings are going to look slightly different because of our personality. But we can also aesthetically force that issue to make lines more expressive by experimenting with line quality. And when we have similar types of line, we create unity. And that unity of line quality and the personality that the lines have qualitatively can help us to communicate a feeling or an idea or a content. Is everybody following me so far? Any questions? Okay. So line quality is all about line variation. A dynamic line means the line has a lot of differences to it. It's not just a monotonous, same line. And actually, I'm going to back out for just a second here. And we're going to look at, let's just look at The Simpsons. Okay, it doesn't want me to look at The Simpsons. There we go. So if we look at, say, a drawing of Homer, you'll see that this is all about outline. So the line has the same thickness all the way around. It's very uniform, probably drawn on a computer. There's no change in darkness. There's no change in thickness or thinness. This is very uniform and has very little dynamic other than the curves versus the straight lines. Now, I see a little bit of line quality variation in this line right here because it begins thin, it gets thicker, and then it ends thin. But other than that single line, every line is just a consistent flat line. So it has very little personality. Maybe there's a little bit right here. When we're dealing with contour lines, we're dealing with lots of variation. This drawing that I'm about to show you is actually a study by an artist named Jacobi Tintoretto. He was a Renaissance era artist. And I just want you to know that up until the Renaissance, drawings were considered as preparatory sketches for more important, more refined things like paintings and sculptures. So it wasn't until the Renaissance period, starting with Leonardo, that you start to see drawing as a medium celebrated. So prior to the Renaissance, drawing was like what architects use to plan a building. You don't go and look at architectural plans in the museum. They're just utilitarian. So this would be something like that. But that doesn't mean that there were better or worse preparatory drawings. Interestingly enough, and this is just kind of an aside, these drawings that were used as preparatory sketches for paintings or sculptures were called cartoons, which is kind of funny because that's not how we define cartoons at all. And cart, what other word do we have the word cart in?
Cartography.
Ah, man, you are awesome. I was so scared nobody was going to get that. And what is cartography?
Isn't it maps and
Yeah,
such?
yeah. So drawings were considered like maps of buildings or maps of figures or maps of landscapes. So that's where that word comes from. All right, so here you see this drawing of a archer by Tintoretto. Very expressive lines. First of all, qualitatively, what has he done to make these lines more expressive than your average human figure? What has he done with the quality of these lines that make it feel like kind of a holistic, unified style that we might only see in Tintoretto's art? What about the nature of all the lines in this drawing make it very unified and cohesive aesthetically and expressively?
None of them are straight.
Yeah. And not only are none of them straight, except for maybe the bowstring, but he's almost exaggerated all of the curves, right? So it's not just about, defining a torso or an arm, it's about exaggerating those convexities of the musculature that's underneath the skin. And that, of course, makes it much more dynamic as a drawing. How else has he varied his line? Where does our eye really go first in this drawing? What lines have the greatest visual weight? The torso. And why is that? Not why did he do that, but why do those lines have greater visual weight than the others? Because they're darker. And that makes them have more, write this word down, contrast with the white of the page. So one way to vary a line is to make it exaggerated in its shape. Another way to vary a line is to make it thicker and darker, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, thinner and lighter. So if you look at this leg as it goes down diagonally across the page, you'll notice that as he gets to this foot on the left side of the drawing, the lines get very light. There's a lot of open areas as opposed to solid areas where the line is separating the foot from the background behind it and enclosing that shape. And that kind of leads our eye up to the torso by virtue of its de-emphasis in visual weight. It becomes subordinate to the emphasis created by greater visual weight, created by darker, thicker, heavier weighted lines. And of course, contrast is dependent on difference. So we've got a white page, so the darker, the thicker the line is against a white page, the more contrasting it's going to be. The lighter, the thinner a line is against a light page, the less visual weight. More visual weight equals more emphasis, equals more eye attractiveness. Less visual weight equals less emphasis, more subordination, less contrast, less visual weight. Does that make sense to everybody? So you can direct the eye by creating dynamic in the line to lead the eye to what's most important in your drawing. It's kind of like in a song, when the person is singing, in the mix of the recording, they turn the instruments down slightly so that the voice becomes emphasized. And as you move through the song to say the guitar solo, all of a sudden the other instruments become muted and the guitar solo gets turned up, right? Even if they're singing underneath the guitar solo, if the guitar solo is meant to be emphasized, if that's what that section of the song is about, that's what they want the viewer to hear the most, so they increase the volume. So line quality is very similar to that. It's about increasing and decreasing the volume, so to speak, or the contrast of the line or the variation of the line in order to lead the eye. I also want you to notice that there's a lot of what I call broken lines. So like right here underneath the bicep, that line of overlap has an opening in it in the head. There's a little opening where the eye can move from the background into the forehead. So there's lots of areas of what I call broken line or areas of passage where the line becomes so faint that you can literally move from outside the form, from the negative space into the form, the positive space. Now this drawing is obviously not a preparatory drawing. This drawing is by the artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, I-N-G-R-E-S, Ingres, and he was an 18th century artist. So let me ask you a question. Ming.
Yes.
Where does your eye go first in this drawing?
It goes to the woman with the child in her lap, like her face.
Okay. And why is that?
Her hair, like, she is more covered, like, so she has, like, the bonnet on. Is that what it is? Yeah. And so, like, her face is just gonna be more shadowed than all the people who don't have it, so I feel like her face just looks darker.
Okay. Ryan.
Yes.
Where does your eye go last?
Probably the woman to the far left, just because she's so separated from everything, and there isn't as much shadow or darker lines on her.
Okay. Keep looking.
There's also a picture on the wall.
Picture on the wall. The white space, I mean, it's there, implied as a wall. It's not just empty space. And I mean, if you really want to get picky, yes, the wall would be the least emphasized because it's got nothing, right? But visually, our eye probably goes to that picture there, or this doorway, or whatever it is here, last. Why is that? Well, Ming said that the face had more detail, it had darker darks, and because it had darker darks, the lights seem lighter. And the picture, which is completely linear and very faint and has lots of broken edges to it, right? Like you can hardly even see the left edge of that frame, but we know it's there, right? Really fades back because of the thinness, the lightness, the lack of contrast, the subordination, the lack of visual weight. Does that make sense? Now, one thing that I will say about Ingres is that what leads us to the faces is the fact that they have tone. They're not just line, they have some shading to them, right? Versus the clothing, which is, this beautiful symphony of line variation. I mean, just look at his lapel. Thick, thin, thick, thin, thick, really thin. Look at how all the internal tertiary details have the pencil on its side instead of on its point, and they're very faint lines. You see that? The deeper shadows, like here and here, the creases that are, stronger have darker lines versus the creases that are fainter have thinner lines. So Ingres was a master of line variation. This is Henri Matisse. He's more modern, whereas Ingres was in the 18th century, the 1700s. Matisse was in the 20th century, early 20th century though. Modern master, he would be called. He and Picasso probably vied for the top spot of greatest artist in the world during that 1930s through 1950s, 60s time period. And Matisse was known for simplification of everything, reducing everything to its essentials to create a statement that in his view, his desire was to communicate beauty and joy and verve and love of life through kind of a simple, raw, bare essentials aesthetic. So what do you notice about Matisse's line variation? Where does our eye go first? Catherine?
I'd say the darker lines
But so specifically, what part of the figure?
of the face.
Right, that's where eye goes first, and then maybe out to her elbow on the left, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Mhm.
because those really dark lines around her eye, shoulder, etc. Notice how, as we move out to the periphery, the lines become less thick, less solid, and more broken, right? There's more space here. You get down here and, look at this little tiny line over to the left that completes the line of her hip as it goes off the page. But, that big broken area. Notice how as this line trails behind this line becomes thicker, this line becomes thinner, and it stops. And it has this little point to it, just short of this overlap. And that pushes the hip forward. You think that, this is just like happenstance. And this drawing looks very easy, but it's actually very complex when it comes to how Matisse was orchestrating the way our eye looks. Matisse, and I think I have another drawing by him here. Matisse, there's a quote by him: "I long for an art of simplicity, devoid of troubling subject matter, like a comfortable chair that a weary businessman comes home to at the end of the day." So he wanted to express joy and peace and rest. Of course, the world is in a great deal of turmoil, World War I, World War II, and Matisse, unlike Picasso, who was a very dark person, was kind of a light in the art world. He wanted to express the finer things in life, the beauty of nature, the beauty of human beings, especially women. And he did so by his use of line in the case of his drawings and by the use of color in his paintings. His paintings were always very bright and cheery in their palette. But again, you get drawn to this woman here and this woman here versus this plant, which, as you can see, as it goes behind the woman, stops just short. We assume that that plant continues behind the woman, right? We don't think, oh, it just stops right there. But because these lines are thicker and these lines kind of trail off, we assume that there's a spatial relationship there and that the woman's shoulder is projecting forward relative to that space. I would also say about Matisse's lines that they're very fluid. Like, you don't get a sense of him laboring over his lines. It's almost like a jazz musician who's just so good at his instrument that he can improvise like that and just flow. Speaking of taking a line for a walk, this would be Paul Klee, who was roughly the same time period. He died younger, so he didn't make it as long as Matisse did, but his art was less about life and more about kind of a spiritual dimension. So his art was much more abstract. So Matisse's work is abstract. It's more abstract than Ingres' work. But even Ingres' work is abstract because it doesn't have color and shadow and all the other components of realism that you would need to be a purely naturalistic realist painting, or drawing for that matter. Whereas Matisse's work is even more simplified, whereas Paul Klee's work is not only more simplified, but it's organized and distorted in such a way that you can barely see the human figure at all, right? But you can. There's hands and a face with a nose and feet. I think this drawing is called Angel. I think it's a depiction of an angel. But he's got this pattern of contour line. Look at how the lines start and then skip along. Our eye gets drawn towards the head and the hands, right? Because they have greater visual weight. He almost loses the lines entirely here. See that? But we still assume those lines continue. And then down to the feet where he's got more visual weight. Again, notice how these lines stop short of this foot, which helps this foot to project forward relative to those lines. These lines break and become thinner, whereas these lines are more solid. And that really emphasizes the overlapping of this plane relative to this plane. Another artist who was wonderful at line variation was Egon Schiele, Egon Scheile. Scheile, Egon Schiele. And he used to draw Parisian prostitutes or his bohemian friends. He was kind of like what do you call, like, in modern terms, not a townie, but like somebody who's really into like trendy hippie, Starbucks drinking, very political, beard wearing.
Are you referring to a hipster?
A hipster, yes, exactly. So thank you. Egon Schiele was a hipster back in the early part of the modern era. But you can, but you can see, look, I mean, this beautiful concentration of darker lines around the face and the hands, whereas there's a subordination of this area and the shoulder. Look at all these broken areas in the shoulder and the forearm, and then look at how he gives us this big, generous, thick double line to push that area of her torso back and to project that foreshortened leg and upper tibia and fibula forward in space. Same thing with this knee right here. Here's some other drawings. I love the way he's using the side of his pencil, and then he twists it to the point, and then back to the side, and then point, and then more pressure here versus less pressure here. Look at how he concentrates thicker, more dark lines in the hands and the faces versus the clothing, just like Ang did. This is an Andy Warhol, early Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol used to be a graphic designer. Of course, he did it the old-fashioned way with screen printing, not digitally. But you know, look at the adventurous way he's using lines here. Thick to thin to really thin to thick again. And the whiskers, look at how they stop short and they become lighter as they move out and thinner. Look at how he doesn't care about these blobs of ink or this stuttering line back here. You know, just imagine if there was a Simpsons outline, how different the image would look as far as its dynamic or its style or aesthetic. This is Ellsworth Kelly, and he does these beautiful, it's kind of funny, I want to show you guys what Ellsworth Kelly's work looks like predominantly. He died a couple years ago, I think 2015. So Ellsworth Kelly is most known for these non-objective paintings. So just paintings of stripes and squares and dots, patterns of color. He did shaped canvases like these, some representation like this flower, but mostly very non-objective images. Okay? But you can see him here. He's not satisfied to just do non-objective. He also studies nature. So this is like a milkweed plant. And you can see how, you know, he moves from lighter lines to darker lines as we concentrate towards this stem. Here's kind of a reversal, a thinner line against a thicker line where the overlap is happening. But that still creates a difference, which creates space. Thicker to thinner, thicker to thinner. thinner lines, thicker lines. Okay, so line variation, dynamic, contrast is all about creating style. It's all about creating interest in the drawing. So, when you're striving to create a unified style, the most unified thing would be everything would be the same, but that would be really boring. So in order to create interest, you use variation and contrast. And it can be all about, I think in the case of Andy Warhol, for instance, it's less about creating space than it is about just creating various lines that are aesthetically different and dynamic. Although there is, some spatial reasoning here, where this line becomes broken and faint versus this line, which becomes very thick. And that helps to reinforce that one ear is in front of the other. But sometimes it's just about contrast for contrast's sake. But it also can be practical, helping to express realistic ideas and observations, such as giving the object a sense of mass, creating space in the composition, looking at light and shadow. All of this can be achieved by line variation. And it's all about light versus dark, thick versus thin, curved versus angular, smooth versus jagged, open lines that have gaps in them versus closed lines. And I don't mean closed lines, closed, C-L-O-S-E-D, closed lines that don't have any gaps or stutter in them. This is Ben Shahn, B-E-N-S-H-A-H-N, Ben Shahn, and he loved creating variety in line, both for expressive as well as practical reasons. So, for instance, if we look at, this line, it's very open and broken versus this line, which is very thick and highly contrasting. And notice how this figure has a little bit more line variation and line weight and emphasis and contrast than this figure, which has a little bit less, more broken lines, thinner lines, versus this figure versus this figure. There's 4 guys there. By the time you get to the 4th guy, it's just like a little tiny indication of a head and a shoulder. But he's still there, right? He's just farther away. So there's a couple reasons why we can create line variations, actually 5. There's overlap. So when one object overlaps another object, the line that's in front of the overlapped object should be darker and heavier than the line that goes behind that object. It should be more closed. The line that goes behind that object should be thinner, grayer, less pressure, and maybe even stop short or taper off as it goes behind that shape. Does that make sense to everybody? Another reason would be proximity and space. So this guy in the foreground, so here's overlap, thinner versus thicker. This guy in the foreground has the most or the majority of darker, thinner, varieties of lines, more ubiquitously, evenly dispersed over the figure, versus the guy behind, which is a little more open, a little broken, a little less closed, a little more open types of lines, a little lighter lines, etc. Primary versus secondary versus tertiary contours. That refers to the outer boundary versus the inner boundary of a shape versus texture. We'll look at that in a second. Light and shadow delineations, like as you look at the still life that you're drawing from, you'll notice there's a light side and a dark side, and there's a sense of division between the light and the shadow. That's another area where you can put a line. Sometimes it's a very harsh line. Sometimes, like in the case of cylinders, it's a very soft line. So it would be a darker, thicker line if it was a very harsh line. It would be a softer, grayer line if it was a very even transition from light to shadow. And then finally, there's change or variation or dynamic for the sake of change or variation or dynamic. So again, when we look back here, there's really no reason that Ben Shahn created those awkward jitters and swelling and angularity of the line, other than just to create a creative kind of line. It was just his decision to do that. Like here, to me, it's interesting that this line is thinner and more open and then becomes thinner again as it goes behind this dark line. But here it's thinner and more open and it becomes thicker as it hits that line. There's really no logical reason to do that other than to say, well, this line gets thinner as it goes behind the breast of this figure, so I might as well do the opposite as it goes behind the head, just for the sake of being different. And that's a kind of variation. And I don't mean different in, well, I'm going to be a peculiar artist. I mean, it's just saying, okay, I did it this way one time. To create a variation, I need to do it in another way. And this is probably the hardest to apprehend or understand or contemplate, because it's really about doing the opposite of what your intuition tells you to do. I had an artist friend who would put his paintbrush down where he wanted it to be, and then he would move it to the left 2 inches, just for the sake of tripping himself up in the process. Of course, over time, that became the way he always did things, so then he had to change and go 2 inches to the right. I had an artist friend who did these very abstract pattern paintings, but instead of using a straight ruler, he used a curved stick, a ruler that wasn't quite straight, in order to give everything just an offness from perfect geometry. So those are all weirdo artist things to do. I just love Ben Shahn's work. The way that he uses line is just gorgeous. I love the way that, for instance, everything in this figure is darker, except for, the hand down here where it gets a little lighter, versus some of the internal tertiary details. But then the rocking chair, everywhere it goes behind that figure, it gets lighter. The lines are thinner. So you can really see how space, so the depth of this figure being closer than this, as well as overlap, as well as internal details versus primary and secondary contours, primary being the outer edge, secondary being the internal shapes, tertiary being these kind of aside details like folds or like the rungs of these chairs, so forth and so on. Really calculating where he's going to do variation in line in order to kind of spatially make sense, as well as being creative in the way that he's using these stuttery lines. Look at how ghostly the lines are behind the head here. Pretty amazing. Okay, so number one is overlap in proximity to create mass and space, both formal elements. Artists express perspective they see in their subject. Hold on, I see a mistake here. Sorry. In nature, the three-dimensionality of a visual is represented by expressing the fundamentals of space. And the fundamentals of space are overlap, scale change, and vertical placement. So when we're dealing, for instance, in a drawing like this, we've got overlap, we've got scale change, and we've got vertical placement. So this overlaps this guy and the chair, the side of the page overlaps the painting, the arm overlaps the column, and then you get all the way back to this guy. This guy has much more complexity, much heavier visual weight in his lines, and he's larger in scale than this guy is. Are you following me here? And then if we, this is the bottom third, this is the middle third, this is the top third. The higher up something is in the composition, the farther away it is. So when you're looking at your composition and deciding, where thinner lines versus thicker lines need to be, those are the types of spatial cues you're looking for. Notice how our eye is led to him. And, these thicker lines, as it goes back, become more emphasized than these thinner lines as they recede in space and as they overlap and as they are placed higher in the composition. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions online so far? Okay. Oh, this is really, these are by David Hockney, Davidhockney. He's an English artist still living. I think he's in his 80s now, so he won't be too much longer with us. But, look at how, this head is bigger than this head. That's a scale change. This guy doesn't have a head that's half the size of this guy's head. It's just further away, right? By making that scale change and by having more open lines, having thinner lines, having less weight in those lines, the head recedes. Notice as these lines go behind the foreground figure, the lines of the legs of the background figure go behind the lines of the arm of the foreground figure, they trail off, they become broken, they become very light, they become very thin, and that emphasizes the space. Now, one thing I would say, well, first of all, primary shapes would be the edge of the figure, generally thicker, versus secondary shapes like the belt, the internals of the collar of the shirt, the eyes, things like that, versus tertiary details like the folds and the hair and the eyebrow lines, etc., the edge of the nose, the peach fuzz, etc. All those are tertiary details. Look at how there's this hierarchy of darker primary lines, slightly less emphasized secondary lines, and least emphasized tertiary lines. Does that make sense? And then there's that idea of change over distance. Look at how David Hockney decided to break the rules by making the guy's face in the background darker. Why did he do that? It doesn't make sense according to the logic that we've set up of space and proximity and overlap and primary versus secondary versus tertiary detail. Why did he decide to make that face darker? Caitlin?
Yes, sir.
Why did he decide to make that background face darker?
Maybe just so we can see better.
I can't hear you. Speak up.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh, perfectly now. Sounded like you were in a well for a second.
Maybe just so we could see it better.
Yeah, because that's an important character in the drama of the drawing, right? It's a relationship between two men lounging around, right? So he wants to attract our eye to that background man. So he gives it greater visual weight, which pulls it forward in a way, spatially. But it's more about emphasis for importance. I want the viewer to move from this guy to this guy and see the relationship. So in that way, it's kind of about creating drama in order to express what he's trying to express. So this would be a very simple contour drawing of a still life. You can see that these lines of overlap create space where these lines are broken and thinner. You can see that the primary contour has variation. There's that shadow line underneath that's thicker, which gives this bottle a feeling of being grounded. These tertiary and secondary details within the bottles are thinner than the primary contours are, where one line overlaps another, there is a break. Look at how this line is thicker, and as it goes back in space, it becomes thinner. Now, I wish that the artist had done that here as well. made this line thicker and get lighter as it goes back here. That would have even more so emphasized the space. I also wish there was more change. Look at how, that's an outline right there. If he had, or she had, had more variation, like this bottom line of the left plane of the box, this top line would have been more interesting. And as you look at your still life, you'll notice, as you squint at it, that there are areas that you can see better and areas that you can see worse, meaning more clearly. We'll talk about that in a second. We already talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary, primary being the outer boundary, secondary being the internal boundaries, and tertiary being the smallest details and textures. We can create hierarchy of importance there by varying our line weight. So this is a better drawing, yes, than the last one. So, these primary contours have darker lines. The secondary contours are dark, but not quite as dark as the primary contours. And then these little areas where you have shadow or delineations of highlight or texture within an object, the lines are very faint. Does that make sense to everybody? Huh? That's why that drawing is better than the last one, right? Because it has more line variation. Now, we're doing an open composition like this. This is a closed composition. I'm sorry, this is an open composition. We're doing a closed composition where everything fits on the page. This has things that go off the page. That's our next drawing. This is even more dynamic as far as line variation is concerned. Yes? So really thick, like double, triple lines around, this shadow side of the gourd. These secondary shapes, like this little spot where the vine grew out. Like these little marks here. Those are actually textural spots that are on the gourds themselves, like little cracks and crevices. These would be lines of shadow delineation that are being cast by objects in front. Plenty of areas, look at how the cloth, the pattern gets thicker and thinner. Look at how this line is thicker and then thinner as it goes back. Look at how this cone is very thin compared to the lid of that container. That light and shadow is all about, creating a sense of where the bottle has a shadow, like a darker versus a lighter, versus a darker versus a lighter side. So light tends to eat away the edge, making it less contrasting and broken, meaning more openness to that line. That means the line is more diffuse or softer. Shadow tends to create a variety of contrasts, sometimes diffuse, sometimes very harsh and focused. So if we look at the edge of a box, the front is dark, the top is light, and there's a very distinct line along that edge. Versus the cone or the cylinder, the transition from dark to light is very soft. So that would be a much softer, more broken line. I think you guys are getting over the idea, or getting the idea. And then there's change over distance, making differences just for the sake of making differences. So, look at how the line becomes thinner, then thicker, then thinner, then thicker, then thicker, then thinner, then thicker, then thinner, then thinner, thick, thin, but not as thin and thick as this, not as broken as this. Each line as it progresses back on this sphere becomes thinner, but each line itself has variation in lightness and darkness, right? Yeah, there's really no reason to have these broken edges here other than to create interest. Look at how boring this line is. And look at how devoid of internal tertiary detail this is. So this drawing is not nearly as interesting as this drawing. You see what I mean? So this I would say like this is an A+ drawing. This is maybe a B+ drawing. And this is maybe a C+ drawing. Does that make sense? Am I just being arbitrary and deciding, oh, I like this artist better or this art, blah, blah, blah? No, I'm being very qualitatively precise about where the grade is coming from. Okay? All right. So the first thing that I want to show you, or I guess the next thing that I want to show you, is stage 1, which is what we're going to be doing today. And really, I think this is all we're going to be able to work on today. So Friday, we'll do the second part of the demo. All right, so this is the diagrammatic gestural phase, okay? Now, let me see, maybe I can, I'm a little confused. Composition. Where did I put my reference images? Very strange. Did I put them under? No. I might be able to show you these both simultaneously. Everybody can still see my screen out in Teams land?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
We can.
Yes, sir.
Good. AirDrop is the greatest thing ever. Okay, so there's the drawing reference. So this phase is just getting everything located, making sure that we have an open composition. We're going to start off with gesture, you'll see, and then I thought there was a way to fit both things. No. And then we'll move to some constructive line to correct relationships, and I'll kind of walk you through it. All right, so I decided that this needed to be a horizontal composition. Obviously, it's wider than it is tall. I get out my H pencil, and I start on the right hand, giving myself a center line, and kind of gesturing out the delineation of that bottle. Now, you should be able to barely see what I'm doing. But as you can see, as we move forward, you start to see it a little bit more. Now I'm working on the box, making guesses for where it touches the bottle, bringing that vertical edge forward, making completely wrong angles, which I'll correct later. Now the front top edge, now I'm triangulating from the top of the bottle to the top left corner to find out where the other side of that edge is. You guys should remember that. Bringing the line in and then down. You should gradually start to see this ghost coming into existence. Now I'm saying, oh, that line's too shallow. I need to make it more angled upward, steeper. This corner needs to be moved over a little bit. And you can see as I move forward, you can see me getting darker, yes? Now the back edge, I drew straight through all of those objects, like the oatmeal container and the bottle. I don't know why my arm's in the way. Finding the center line, of that oatmeal container, triangulating from the bottle to the top to find the top of that shape, drawing the left edge, then coming across and drawing the right edge. Giving a little more emphasis to that line as it goes behind and is overlapped by the oatmeal. Now the bottom ellipse. Now I'm drawing the center line of the bottle just to the left of that oatmeal container. I'm finding where the bottom of that bottle is relative to the bottom corner of the box. Drawing the right side, gesturing across to the left side, finding the bottom ellipse, drawing in a circle for the shoulder and a conical shape, very simplified for the neck. It's a little long, I'll change that later. Notice I'm drawing straight through things. Now I'm triangulating to find the top of that cone. Sorry, my shoulder's in the way there. Finding the bottom, using the center line, overlapping that shape so that I can draw through. I'll bring the box back on top later, gesturing in the circle or sphere. While I'm at it, I might as well. And I start off too small and I gradually grow it bigger. Always start on the small side. It's easier to make things bigger than it is to make things smaller, right? Now I'm starting on the bottom of that cookie dish. And again, you should notice that everything is very light still. So all my gestures, all my diagramming is very light. Because I want to do as little erasing as possible. Now I'm doing the center line of that top bottle. My shoulder's in the way, of course. There's no good way to photograph these things. Finding the top. Now I noticed here that the bottle looked a little short, which I think I did the other day. I also noticed that the ellipse was too big. So I think what happened is I needed to pay more attention to where that cookie tin was touching my oatmeal container, which meant bringing it down a little bit. You can see me retriangulating to make sure that's in the right spot. Now by bringing that cookie tin down, I'm able to make my bottle a little bit longer. Again, drawing through the bottle, not up to the edge. Drawing the bottle over the oatmeal container. Later, I'll insert the edge of that oatmeal container on top of the bottle. Not dealing with a lot of tertiary detail like shadows or anything at this point. Again, I'm adjusting the top of that ellipse down because I felt like it was too thin. Again, I'm triangulating. Now, one thing I noticed later is that this cone is way too tall. So it's going to need to come down. If you vertically scan or horizontally scan from the top of my cone over, it touches too high up on that bottle, so I'm going to need to bring it down. Now I'm correcting that edge again. Too shallow. Probably still too shallow. I don't know what I'm doing now. Yeah, see there I'm measuring the angle and saying, you idiot, why is it so shallow? So I need to bring it up. No sweat. I noticed that it was touching the oatmeal container too far down. It looks like it's just below half of the oatmeal container where that line goes behind. So I had to move it up some because I'm really bad at drawing. And I make mistakes. See how that shape looks better now, right? So I made a correction. But it's so light that you can't really see that I made that correction. Sorry. Now I'm starting to kind of get into a little bit of a more emphasized line, and I'm looking for areas of overlap. So where that container overlaps that cookie tin. Not because I'm really getting into contour so much as I want to see my correct lines, but they can become part of contour later. Notice how like I start off with a pretty firm pressure, and then I kind of flick it away. So it's like Harry Potter, swish and flick, or flick and swish, or whatever it is. And what that winds up with is a line that starts blunt and then trails off, which creates a transition from dark to light. Also notice that I'm not completing any one shape. I'm moving from one side of the drawing to the other. Now I'm reasserting that edge over the cone. Just draw one little line at the edge. Oh, and then another little line at the edge of that sphere. But I'm not, on, out, line all the way around. I'm getting a little bit into contour now, but I'm also refining shape. Making decisions. Starting at the edge, flicking and switching. That edge back on top, that's a moment of overlap. So you should be seeing the drawing kind of gradually, as a whole, lifting up. It's not one shape gets finished, and the next shape gets finished, and the next shape gets finished. It's like I'm trying to orchestrate the whole drawing at once so that it kind of breathes itself into existence. And when you work the whole as opposed to working part by part, you're thinking more about the relationships between all of the individual objects that make up that whole instead of just thinking this object separate from this object, separate from this object. "18 seconds left. Now I'm using my kneaded eraser, not to get rid of the line, but just to kind of smooth it out and clean it up a little bit. And that kneaded eraser is good because it doesn't completely destroy or get rid of the line. It just softens it a little bit. All right, so that's the end of that part. And obviously, I'm going to post today's class so you can rewatch it again on a computer. I do want everybody to look at this still life. And then we'll just do a little bit of our initial drawing to get the composition set up. So everybody squint. Now, and when I say squint, I mean really squint. So what you're doing when you squint at a photograph or at a still life is you're activating the rods and the cones in your eyes, specifically the rods, which are the light sensitive. And you have to keep your eyes squinted. So don't open your eyes. Keep them squinted. I'm serious. Okay? Squint your eyes. So this is like when you walk into a dark room and your eyes gradually adjust. What's happening is you're getting your rods to activate which makes you more sensitive to differences in value and edge. So everybody's squinting. Let me ask a question.